Episode 1: The Crash into the White Void. The silence of the Arctic is not peaceful. It is heavy, crushing, and absolute. For thousands of miles in every direction, there is nothing but shifting ice, frozen oceans, and a wind that cuts through flesh like a razor blade. Humans were never meant to survive here. We are fragile creatures of warmth and comfort, entirely dependent on the technology we build to shield ourselves from the raw fury of Mother Nature. But what happens when that technology fails? What happens when the metal cage you trusted to carry you across the frozen roof of the world suddenly breaks, leaving you entirely alone in a desert of white death? This is the story of ultimate human endurance. This is the story of a man who looked into the abyss of the frozen north, smiled back, and refused to die. It began as a routine flight. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind of color that blurs the horizon until you cannot tell where the ice ends and the clouds begin. Arthur was an experienced pilot, a man who had spent more than a decade navigating the unpredictable air currents of the Northern Territories. His cargo was simple: scientific equipment and supplies for a remote research outpost located deep within the Arctic Circle. To anyone else, the endless expanse of white below would look terrifying, but to Arthur, it was just another day at the office. The twin engines of his utility plane hummed a familiar, comforting tune. He checked his instruments, noted the steady drop in external temperature, and took a sip of hot coffee from his thermos. Everything was perfect. Everything was under control. Until the starboard engine coughed. It wasn't a loud explosion, just a sudden, violent shudder that vibrated through the steering yoke. Arthur's eyes instantly darted to the control panel. The oil pressure gauge was dropping fast, the needle plummeting into the red zone like a stone. Before he could even process the data, a harsh, metallic grinding noise. Episode 2: The Assessment of Ruin. Arthur crawled out from the shattered cockpit, his boots sinking deep into the powdery snow. The cold hit him like a physical blow. It didn't just chill his skin, it felt as though it was instantly freezing the air inside his lungs. The temperature was easily 40 degrees below zero, and with the wind chill, it was much worse. At this temperature, exposed flesh freezes in less than 10 minutes. Hypothermia doesn't wait. It begins its slow, insidious attack the moment your core temperature drops even a fraction of a degree. Arthur knew he had to move, despite the agonizing pain in his ribs and the dizzying throb in his head. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. In the Arctic, panic is a death sentence. His first priority was shelter and assessment. He turned to look at the wreckage of his plane. The aircraft was completely ruined. The tail section was twisted like a piece of scrap metal, the wings were gone, and the main fuselage was cracked open, exposing the interior to the blowing snow. The engine that had failed was a charred mess of blackened metal. There would be no fixing this. There would be no flying out. His survival now depended entirely on what he could salvage from the broken hull. Arthur limped back into the cargo hold, his movements slow and deliberate to conserve energy. Every movement brought a sharp flare of pain from his chest, but he forced himself to push through it. He began dragging items out of the snow that had drifted into the fuselage. The inventory was grim. Much of the heavy scientific equipment was smashed beyond recognition. However, fortune favors the prepared. In the back of the cabin, he found his cold-weather survival gear, packed tightly in a heavy-duty canvas duffel bag. He unzipped the bag with trembling, gloved hands. Inside was a high-grade Arctic sleeping bag, a small multi-tool, a portable camp stove with 2 canisters of fuel, a basic first aid kit, and a small supply of emergency RA. Episode 3: The First Night. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a bruised purple sky that quickly faded into an absolute, pitch-black darkness. With the disappearance of the sun, the temperature plummeted dramatically, dropping well into the -50s. The wind transformed from a low whistle into a roaring beast, throwing heavy sheets of dry, crystalline snow against the ruined fuselage of the airplane. Inside his makeshift shelter, Arthur was engaged in a literal battle for his life. He had spent the final hours of twilight packing snow against the largest cracks in the plane's aluminum hull, trying to create a windbreak. But metal is a terrible insulator. It absorbed the deep freeze of the Arctic night and radiated it inward. Arthur sat on a pile of salvaged cargo blankets, huddled inside his sub-zero sleeping bag, but the cold still found its way in. It crept up from the frozen floorboards, seeped through the fabric of his gear, and settled deep into his bones. His teeth chattered violently, a physical reaction he could not control as his body desperately tried to generate heat through involuntary muscle movement. Every breath he took felt like swallowing broken glass. The air was so dry and cold that it burned his throat and lungs. He knew that if he fell into a deep sleep now, his core temperature might drop past the point of no return, and he would simply never wake up. To stay awake, Arthur forced his mind to work. He repeated navigation coordinates in his head, recalled memories from his childhood, and counted the seconds as they ticked away on his mechanical wristwatch. Time became an agonizingly slow crawl. Every hour felt like an eternity. Around midnight, a new danger emerged. Above the howling of the wind, Arthur heard a sound that made his blood run colder than the ice outside. It was a low, guttural scrape against the outside of the fuselage. Something was moving out there. Something heavy. He held his breath, his heart pounding. Episode 4: The Internal Fire. The bear eventually drifted away into the blizzard, leaving Arthur alone with the cold once more. When the pale light of dawn finally broke through the frost-covered wreckage, Arthur knew he had survived the hardest test, but his resources were already depleting. His body had burned thousands of calories just to stay alive through the night. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and the pain in his cracked ribs had intensified into a dull, constant ache. He crawled out of his sleeping bag, his joints stiff and unyielding. The first priority of the day was water. Arthur took his small portable camp stove and set it up inside the safest corner of the fuselage. He filled a small aluminum cup with clean, hard-packed snow from outside and lit the burner. The blue flame flickered to life, casting a warm, comforting glow on his frostbitten face. Watching the snow slowly melt into liquid water felt like a massive victory. However, he had to be smart. He only had 2 small canisters of fuel. If he used the stove constantly just to melt snow, he would run out of fuel within 4 days. He needed to find an alternative way to create fire or conserve his energy. While waiting for the water to boil, Arthur unwrapped his first protein bar. He ate it slowly, forcing himself to chew thoroughly, treating every bite like precious fuel for an engine. He looked at his remaining rations. 4 bars left. A few pieces of dried meat. This was not a survival plan, it was a countdown to starvation. With the water boiled and cooled enough to drink, he drank deeply, feeling the hydration bring life back to his fatigued muscles. His mind cleared, and he began to look at his situation objectively. The radio was dead. The rescue teams, if they were searching, would be looking near his last known flight path, but the storm last night could have covered the wreckage in snow, making it invisible from the air. He couldn't just sit here and wait to freeze or be eaten. He needed. Episode 5: Building the Snow Fortress. The sun provided no warmth, only a blinding glare that bounced off the infinite white plains. Arthur knew that staying inside the metal fuselage was a slow death sentence. To survive the dropping temperatures, he had to use the very element that threatened to kill him, the snow. In the Arctic, properly packed snow is an excellent insulator because it traps air pockets, creating a barrier against the extreme external cold. He needed to build a snow trench shelter before his physical strength deteriorated any further. Using a piece of broken plastic from the airplane's interior panel as a makeshift shovel, Arthur began to dig. Every scoop of snow sent a sharp, agonizing jolt through his fractured ribs. He had to stop frequently, leaning against the wreckage, gasping for breath as the cold air burned his lungs. He dug a trench about 3 feet deep and 6 feet long, just enough space for his body to lie down. He then carved out blocks of hard, wind-compacted snow and carefully angled them over the top of the trench to form a self-supporting roof. By the time the shelter was complete, Arthur's hands were completely numb, despite his heavy gloves. He crawled into the tiny, cave-like space and pulled his sleeping bag inside. Almost immediately, he noticed a difference. The howling wind was blocked out, and within 30 minutes, his own body heat began to warm the confined space. It wasn't comfortable, and it felt claustrophobic, but it was safe. He had created a fortress against the wind, a tiny pocket of life in a world of absolute freezing death. Episode 6: The Inventory of Hope. On the third morning, the weather cleared completely, revealing a stark, beautiful, and terrifying landscape. The visibility was perfect, which meant that if a rescue plane flew overhead, this was his best chance to be seen. Arthur crawled out of his snow shelter, his muscles stiff from the cramped space, and began working on a visual signal. He needed something that would break the monotonous white geometry of the Arctic pack ice and catch the eye of a pilot thousands of feet above. He gathered everything dark or colorful from the wreckage. He laid out pieces of insulation foam, dark oil-stained engine covers, and the bright orange flight cases in the shape of a massive X on a nearby elevated ice ridge. He stamped down the snow around the cross to create shadows, which are often easier to spot from the air than objects themselves. With the signal complete, Arthur conducted a meticulous audit of his remaining resources. He sat down inside the plane's broken hull and lined up his supplies. 3 protein bars. 1 small package of dried beef. 1 full canister of stove fuel and 1 half-empty canister. A small first aid kit, a hunting knife, and his multi-tool. At his current rate of consumption, he would be completely out of food in 48 hours. He realized that relying on a rescue team was a gamble he might lose. He had to think about the unthinkable. He had to find a way to secure food from the environment, or he would have to start walking toward the coast. Episode 7: The Silent Enemy. By day 4, a new symptom began to threaten Arthur's survival: snow blindness. Despite the overcast sky that developed later in the day, the ultraviolet rays from the sun were reflecting off the white snow from every angle, effectively burning his corneas. He began to experience a gritty, painful sensation in his eyes, as if someone had thrown sand into them. His vision blurred, and the constant glare brought on a migraine that made it nearly impossible to concentrate. Arthur knew the danger of going completely blind in this environment. Without vision, he wouldn't be able to maintain his shelter, melt water, or watch out for predators. He needed immediate protection. He took his multi-tool and a strip of dark plastic from the plane's dashboard. He carved a primitive pair of snow goggles, mimicking the traditional designs used by indigenous Arctic hunters for thousands of years. He cut 2 narrow, horizontal slits into the plastic, which drastically reduced the amount of light entering his eyes while still allowing him a limited field of view. Wearing his makeshift goggles, the agonizing glare subsided slightly, allowing him to function. However, the physical toll of the environment was accelerating. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his fingers were showing early signs of frostnip, waxy and white at the tips, and the lack of fresh nutrients was making him dizzy whenever he stood up too fast. The Arctic was slowly grinding him down, chipping away at his defenses piece by piece. Episode 8: The Mirage of the Ice. Isolation does strange things to the human mind. By the 5th day, the absolute silence began to play tricks on Arthur's brain. The auditory deprivation was so severe that his mind started creating sounds to fill the void. He would suddenly spin around, convinced he heard the sound of an engine in the distance, only to find nothing but the empty horizon. He heard voices, whispers of his family, the hum of conversations in distant rooms, the ring of a telephone. The psychological battle was becoming just as brutal as the physical one. It was incredibly easy to give up, to simply crawl into the sleeping bag, close his eyes, and let the cold take him. The temptation to sleep was an almost overwhelming physical pull. To fight the despair, Arthur established a strict daily routine. He woke up at exactly the same time, melted his morning water, checked his visual signals, and forced himself to walk a perimeter around the crash site to keep his blood circulating. During one of his walks, he saw something incredible on the horizon: a ship, its dark hull clearly visible against the ice, just a few miles away. Joy surged through his chest. He began to run toward it, stumbling over the rough ice, shouting at the top of his lungs. But after a few hundred yards, the shape began to shift and warp, stretching into the sky before dissolving into nothingness. It was a fata morgana, a complex mirage caused by temperature inversions in the polar air. The crushing weight of disappointment almost brought him to his knees. There was no ship. He was still entirely, completely alone. Episode 9: The Arctic Hunter. The starvation was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp, localized cramping in Arthur's stomach that drained his remaining physical strength. His emergency protein bars were completely gone. The last scrap of dried meat had been consumed 24 hours prior. He was now running on nothing but pure willpower and the stored fat left in his body. He knew that within days, his muscles would begin to atrophy, making it impossible to collect snow for water or maintain his shelter. As he sat near the edge of a massive ice pressure ridge, his eyes caught a sudden flash of movement near a small crack in the sea ice. It was a ringed seal, poking its dark, wet nose through a breathing hole to catch a breath of air. The animal was cautious, scanning the white landscape for polar bears before slipping back beneath the freezing black water. Arthur's survival instincts instantly took over. He was not a hunter, but hunger transforms a man. He knew he couldn't catch a seal in open water, but if he could wait by the breathing hole, he might have a single chance to secure hundreds of pounds of life-saving fat and protein. He grabbed his multi-tool and lashed his heavy hunting knife securely to the end of a long, sturdy piece of aluminum tubing salvaged from the plane's wreckage. He had constructed a primitive harpoon. He wrapped his body in blankets to camouflage his dark clothing against the snow, crawled slowly toward the breathing hole, and waited in the freezing wind, completely motionless, praying for the animal to return. Episode 10: The Choice at the Ice Hole. For 4 agonizing hours, Arthur lay on the frozen ice. The cold seeped directly through his layers, numbing his legs and arms until he could barely feel his fingers wrapped around the aluminum spear. His breath came in slow, shallow gasps, freezing instantly into a heavy crust of frost on his makeshift snow goggles. He knew that if he moved even an inch, the vibration through the ice would scare the seal away forever. Suddenly, the water inside the small hole began to ripple. Bubbles broke the surface. Arthur raised his arms slowly, his muscles screaming in protest, positioning the blade directly above the opening. The seal's dark head emerged, exhaling a loud, wet puff of air. This was the moment. His life depended on the next split second. He thrust the blade downward with every ounce of strength left in his body. The strike was true, but the ice around the hole was slick, and his numb hands lost their grip on the smooth metal handle. The wounded animal thrashed violently, splashing freezing water onto Arthur's face and chest before diving back down into the dark depths of the ocean, taking the makeshift spear with it. Arthur sat on the edge of the hole, watching the dark blood stain the white snow before being washed away by the water. He had failed. He was now soaked with salt water, his only weapon was gone, and the temperature was beginning to drop as twilight approached. Episode 11: The Deadly Freeze. Getting wet in the Arctic is an immediate medical emergency. The salt water on Arthur's jacket and face began to freeze instantly into a hard, stiff sheet of ice. Water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air. If he didn't dry himself immediately, hypothermia would claim his life within the hour. He scrambled back to his snow-drenched shelter, his body shaking so violently that he could barely crawl through the narrow entrance. He stripped off his outer jacket, using a dry corner of his sleeping bag to desperately scrub the freezing moisture from his skin and clothing. He lit his portable camp stove, using the very last of his fuel canister. The tiny blue flame was his only defense against the creeping paralysis in his limbs. He huddled over the stove, watching the flame flicker and die as the last drops of gas were consumed. The silence that followed was absolute. He had no food, no heat source, no weapon, and his clothing was damp. The internal temperature of his snow shelter began to drop rapidly. Arthur crawled deep into his sleeping bag, pulled the hood tight around his face, and began to pray. He realized that the psychological barrier he had maintained for days was cracking. The dark thoughts he had fought so hard to suppress were finally breaking through the surface. Episode 12: The Breaking Point. The sixth night was a descent into delirium. Feverish from the infection developing in his frostbitten fingers and weak from lack of food, Arthur floated between consciousness and vivid, terrifying nightmares. He dreamed of warm summer days, of the sound of rain on a tin roof, of the smell of hot food cooking in a kitchen. Every time he woke up, the reality of the cold layout before him felt like a physical blow to his chest. His toes had lost all sensation. When he tried to move them, there was only a dull, empty void. This was the second stage of frostbite. The tissue was freezing, turning hard and white. If he survived, he would likely lose his feet. The pain from his cracked ribs had faded into a numb ache, masked by the sheer intensity of the systemic cold freezing his nerve endings. At 3 a.m., the wind died down completely. The absolute stillness of the Arctic night was louder than any storm. Arthur looked out of the small air hole of his snow trench at the sky. The aurora borealis was dancing overhead, giant ribbons of green and violet light twisting across the stars. It was a display of unimaginable beauty, a cosmic dance taking place over a graveyard of ice. Arthur looked at the lights and felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He realized that his struggle was reaching its logical conclusion. He had fought with everything he had, but nature was simply too vast, too cold, and too indifferent to his survival. He closed his eyes, letting the beautiful green lights fade into darkness. Episode 13: The Awakening. Arthur did not die in the night. He woke up to the sound of his own ragged breathing, the morning light piercing through the cracks of his snow shelter. His body was stiff, and his limbs felt as heavy as lead, but the spark of life inside him refused to go out. The delirium of the previous night had cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He was still alive, and as long as he had breath in his lungs, he had a choice: lay down and surrender, or stand up and fight. He crawled out of the trench into the blinding white morning. The air was perfectly still, and the temperature had risen slightly. His feet were numb, but by stomping them against the hard pack ice, he managed to restore enough circulation to walk. He looked at his ruined plane, then out at the endless horizon. He realized that waiting for rescue at the crash site was no longer an option. His signals hadn't been seen, his food was gone, and his fuel was spent. If he stayed here, he would die. His only chance of survival was to abandon the wreckage and begin walking south toward the open ocean, where whaling ships or coastal settlements might be found. He packed his remaining gear into the canvas duffel bag. He took the airplane's compass, a small map from the cockpit, his sleeping bag, and a few pieces of reflective aluminum to use as signaling mirrors. He didn't look back. With a slow, limping stride, Arthur took his first steps away from the safety of the wreckage, embarking on a desperate march across the frozen desert. Episode 14: The March into Nothingness. Walking on Arctic sea ice is nothing like walking on a frozen lake. The surface is a chaotic maze of pressure ridges, massive walls of ice forced upward by the colliding tectonic forces of the ocean currents. Arthur had to climb over jagged blue blocks the size of cars, then drop down into deep, powdery snowdrifts that swallowed him up to his waist. Every step required immense physical effort, burning through the very last of his body's energy reserves. Navigating was a nightmare. Without trees, hills, or landmarks, the white landscape offered no sense of perspective. It was easy to walk in circles without realizing it. Arthur kept his eyes glued to the small magnetic compass in his hand, forcing himself to maintain a strict southward heading. By afternoon, the wind returned, bringing with it a light drift that obscured the horizon. The world became a whiteout, a terrifying meteorological phenomenon where the sky and the ground blend into a single, shadowless void. Space loses its meaning. You cannot tell if an obstacle is 10 feet away or 10 miles away. Arthur stumbled, falling face first into the snow. He lay there for a long time, the cold instantly pressing against his chest. His body ached, and his cracked ribs throbbed with every heartbeat. He forced himself back to his feet, using a long stick to feel the ground ahead of him, moving forward blindly through the white fog. Episode 15: The Treacherous Path. On the 8th day of his ordeal, the ice beneath Arthur's feet began to change. The solid, ancient ice pack was giving way to younger, thinner sea ice. He could hear it, a low, deep groaning sound that echoed from beneath the frozen crust, the voice of the ocean moving under the weight of the winter freeze. Thin ice is a death trap. If he broke through, the current would drag him beneath the ice pack within seconds, and the freezing water would stop his heart before he could even cry out. Arthur slowed his pace, testing the ice ahead of him with his stick before transferring his weight. Suddenly, a sharp crack like a rifle shot echoed through the air. The ice beneath his right foot split open. He threw his body backward just as a wide fissure opened up, exposing the black, churning water of the Arctic Ocean beneath. The gap was widening rapidly, separating the ice sheet he was standing on from the path ahead. He was trapped on a moving ice floe. Arthur scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked across the widening gap of freezing water. There was only one option. He took a short, painful run and leaped across the dark chasm, landing heavily on the far side as the ice groaned beneath his impact. He slid several feet, gripping the snow with his frostbitten fingers, safe for now, but shaking with terror. Episode 16: The Gift of the Sea. Starvation was now causing Arthur to hallucinate flashes of light in his peripheral vision. He hadn't eaten a solid meal in 4 days, and his weight had dropped dramatically. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his lips were split open from dehydration. He was operating purely on adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive. As he skirted the edge of a large lead, a wide channel of open water within the ice pack, he spotted something washed up on the frozen shoreline. He hurried forward, his limping stride turning into a clumsy run. It was the carcass of a large fish, likely thrown onto the ice by a recent storm or left behind by a predator. It was frozen solid, encased in a layer of clear ice. To a civilized man, it would have looked unappetizing, but to Arthur, it was a feast sent from heaven. He used his multi-tool to chip the fish out of the ice. He didn't have the means to build a fire, nor the time to melt it. Using his small knife, he shaved off thin strips of the frozen, raw fish meat and forced them into his mouth. The cold flesh numbed his tongue, but as it melted, his body received a sudden, massive injection of pure protein and essential fats. It was the turning point. The raw energy flooded his system, clearing the fog from his mind and giving his failing muscles the strength they needed to keep moving. Episode 17: The Sound of Hope. On the 9th day, the landscape began to shift again. The chaotic pressure ridges slowly flattened into a wide, open expanse of coastal shelf ice. Arthur knew from his aviation maps that this meant he was getting closer to the edge of the continent. But his physical condition was reaching a critical limit. The energy from the frozen fish had been spent, and his frostbitten feet were becoming increasingly difficult to lift. Every mile felt like 10. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, Arthur stopped in his tracks. He held his breath, tilting his head toward the wind. Through the steady hiss of the blowing snow, he thought he heard a distant, rhythmic thumping sound. It wasn't the erratic howling of the wind, nor was it the deep groaning of the shifting ice sheets. It was mechanical. It was steady. Thump. 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 His heart leaped into his throat. A helicopter. Arthur desperately dropped his canvas bag and searched inside with trembling hands for his pieces of reflective aluminum panel. He scrambled up the highest snowbank he could find, holding the metal plate up to the pale sunlight, angled toward the direction of the sound. He flashed it back and forth, creating a brilliant, pulsing beam of light that cut through the Arctic haze like a beacon. Episode 18: The Final Struggle. The sound grew louder, then began to fade. The helicopter was moving parallel to his position, unaware that a lone survivor was standing on a snowdrift just a few miles away. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Arthur's chest. This was his chance. If they passed him now, he would never have the strength to survive another night in the open. He didn't just flash the metal panel. He began to run toward the sound, ignoring the agonizing screams of his cracked ribs and the complete lack of feeling in his feet. He stumbled, falling hard into a hidden snow pocket, his face burying into the freezing powder. He forced himself back up, his vision swimming with dark spots, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He took off his dark winter cap and began waving it violently in the air while reflecting the light with his other hand. "Here!" he screamed, though his voice was nothing more than a raspy whisper against the vastness of the Arctic. "I'm here!" Suddenly, the pitch of the mechanical thumping changed. The distant black speck in the sky turned, banking sharply to the left. The pilots had spotted the flashing metallic reflection against the monotonous white desert. The machine was heading straight toward him. Episode 19: The Descent of Angels. The massive search and rescue helicopter loomed larger in the sky, its powerful rotors kicking up a blinding, cyclonic storm of snow as it hovered above the ice shelf. For Arthur, the world seemed to move in slow motion. The intense downwash of the rotors pressed against his chest, but he stood his ground, tears freezing instantly on his cheeks as he watched the mechanical savior descend. The heavy landing skis touched down on the hard-packed snow. The side door slid open, and 3 figures dressed in bright neon survival gear jumped out, carrying a medical stretcher and emergency blankets. They ran toward him through the swirling whiteout. When the first rescuer reached him and grabbed his arm, the immense wall of adrenaline that had kept Arthur moving for 9 days straight suddenly collapsed. His knees buckled. The world began to spin, and the white landscape faded into a warm, comfortable blackness. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He didn't feel the pain in his ribs. He was safe. The battle was over. Episode 20: The Triumph of the Spirit. Arthur woke up to the steady beep of a medical monitor and the unfamiliar, intoxicating sensation of warmth. He was lying in a clean hospital bed at a northern military base, wrapped in layers of thermal blankets. A doctor stood nearby, checking his vitals with a look of pure astonishment on his face. He had lost 2 toes to frostbite, and his body would need months to fully recover from the severe malnutrition, dehydration, and cracked ribs. But he was alive. The rescue team told him that his survival was nothing short of a miracle. No one was expected to live through a plane crash and 9 days alone in the high Arctic winter with such limited gear. They asked him how he managed to keep going when everything was stacked against him. Arthur looked out the hospital window at the distant, frozen horizon. He smiled faintly, his lips still cracked from the dry polar air. He didn't survive because he was stronger than the Arctic. He survived because he respected it, because he refused to let panic dictate his choices, and because the human will to live is a fire that even the coldest place on earth cannot put out. He had looked into the white void of death, and he had chosen life.